question is, well, Nana Asma clearly benefited from the fact that she was the caliph's sister to get the influence that she had in that region. But I wonder to what extent elsewhere in West Africa women were equally influential in other parts of West Africa outside of the Caliphate, shall we say, like in Senegal, for instance. Other examples similar to that of Nana Asma? That's the first question. And the other one, also related to Nana Asma, is to what extent might one evaluate, even roughly, the importance of her legacy, you might say, and the current she started in Islamic scholarship in African American Islam, or black Muslims, if you will. There are clearly other sources that brought Islam to the United States, and specifically to the African American community, and they were not necessarily from West Africa. I mean, just thinking of Elijah Muhammad or Malcolm X, for instance, I'm sure that this was a particularly important influence. Is there a way of sort of assessing what you might call of all the rivulets that contributed to the making of African American Islam? What was the importance of the Nana Asma legacy?
To answer your first question, the deeper you dig, the more women you find at every level of history as important figures. For instance, when I was in Cairo, I learned that during the colonial period, and that means prior to the colonial period, the woman who set the daily grain prices at the market was a woman. And she used to come and meet with the emir every day. This is what the emir told me at that time when he was young and his father was emir. This is what he saw going on. In towns, in villages, everywhere there were women involved in the Bori spirit possession cult, and it was women who orchestrated that, and there was one woman in charge of organizing women. In fact, this was something that Nana Asma wanted to revise. She appropriated the huge hat that those women used to wear, and the concept of women's leadership in a spirit possession context, and she kept some of the titles in the organization and yet replaced it with Orthodox Islamic activities, including education. So we know that prior to the time that the jihad happened and the resocialization, the reformation of Islam happened through the jihad in the 19th century. Prior to that time, women were significantly involved in social activities and in social organization all through the Maghreb. So that's a short answer to that part of your question, and if we had time we could talk about more examples. To answer your second question, I was interested in how all these pieces of African American Islam fit together. In fact, we were talking about this over lunch, and I have been looking for answers to that and recently, and have learned that for instance, someone like Sylviane Diop's work on slaves and their identities during the colonial period here, during the slaving time in this country, were predominantly Muslim and mostly Qadariya Sufis, which is very interesting. I didn't know that. I was surprised to learn that. And the Nation of Islam that evolved through the work of several significant figures was more recently moved into Orthodox Sunni Islam by Warathdin Muhammad, who has embraced Qadariya Sufi Sunni Islam. And so demographically what we're looking at in this country is the combined legacy of the slave tradition being predominantly focused on Qadariya Sunni Islam in that heritage, and the new resurgence of interest in and adherence to the Qadariya Sunni Sufi identity This has fluctuated on the East Coast where the Salafis have been more or less involved, but much less involved since 9/11 because they have endured more surveillance. There is the Salafi movement, the Maghrabi Institute in Texas, run by Al-Sharif. But he's much softer on Sufis than other Salafis have been, and less rigidly orthodox. And I have learned that as for the West Coast, although there's been fluctuation on the East Coast between more or less conservative, on the West Coast it's mostly been Sufis, just kind of horizontal, laid-back Sufi involvement when it comes to American Muslims. So my answer to your question from the sources that I have right now is that demographically it's overwhelmingly Sunni, Sufi, Qadariya, and that has been the case as a result of both heritage and new interest at the turn of this millennium. So does that answer your question? Other questions? Yes?
On a similar note, the largest Muslim populations in the U.S. are obviously Middle Eastern and South Asian immigrant communities. Has there been any sort of similar type of women's education movements within those communities?
Well, that is a very interesting question that on the one hand I'm not able to answer yet. I'm working on it. On the other hand, part of the answer, and I'll come back to that in a minute, part of the answer is that there's a whole generation, second generation Muslim American kids, some of whom are the children of the hippie movement where their parents went off to Egypt or someplace for a year or two, and then there's the Abiku community, there's a whole group in Berkeley, there's a group in North Carolina, South Carolina, Sheikh Durkee, these are all the things we were talking about at lunch, who are all those different affiliations, Naqshbandi and Chisti and all these Asian affiliations. Baba Muhyiddin came from Bangladesh to Philadelphia. His tomb is there with adherents that are now going on second generation of his adherents. Coleman Barks and the Rumi stuff all involved. Barks is one of his people. And also in Philadelphia you have Qadariyas, Buchichi Qadariyas from Fez, living quite happily with the Baba Muhyiddin people who are a different brotherhood, and then other people variously affiliated with the Abiku people or the North Carolina people. So I think part of my answer to you is it will be interesting to see what the second generation is doing. I was sitting at a table at a conference at the International Museum of Muslim Cultures in February in Jackson, Mississippi, with a second generation Naqshbandi and second generation Chisti. Naqshbandi is very American, grew up in Abiku, lives in St. Louis now. And so there are all these examples. Now, to go back to the first part of your question, part of what I'm working on now is the first, second generation relationship. A lot of my students go through this huge, intro to Islam, women in Islam courses, Muslim women's autobiographies, Sufi literature. I have all these Muslims in Kansas, and a lot of them grew up in Kansas. And it's very interesting to me that, a town of Salina, Wichita has a big Muslim community. Even the small places, and I'll say to them, why are you taking this course? And they're because we didn't learn it at home. And the idea is that they're second generation, but they're first generation Americans, and their parents are all about getting them to be part of the community. Don't fail them, But the young women, when they turn 16, don't want to deal with all the dating when they slap that veil on and no problem. And now as I see these students go through the college education, graduate, and then come back to visit me, and they're working in Washington or working somewhere else, they are modifying their South Asian or East Asian cultural influence and Americanizing it and affiliating with more, in fact, Qadariya Sufi groups that they meet out there, and they're kind of tweaking their Islam to be their own American Islam. And what I see is a convergence of all those second-generation immigrant community people who are not connected to Maghrebi Qadariya, but then mixing with all of the heritage of that exists here. And I think this new American Islam that will really begin to take hold and take form in the next several decades is becoming a new kind of Islam for the 21st century. So it's a long answer to your question, and it's not really an answer because it's all still in process, but that's all I know right now. So hope that helps. Yes.
Thank you for this insightful look inside Nigerian and American Islamic communities. It seems, by definition, it's very northern